Okay? So there's one example of terrorism, planting of bombs in country marketplaces. Where else would soldiers maybe go to wind down if they had some time off? Bar or nightclub. And they would plant bombs in the bars and nightclubs and have them explode. Anybody, you guys, I get older every year. Anybody seen the movie Good Morning Vietnam? Anybody seen that? Okay, do you remember when they blew up the bar?
Yeah.
When he was in there? Perfect example. We might have to watch that when we have time. It's a pretty good movie. It's kind of a comedy, but it's got some good serious points to it. Robin Williams is the main character in that. It's very good. Another thing they did is they would place bombs in the middle of busy cities, hoping by chance they could blow them up and get some of the enemy out of their way. So they planted bombs in busy cities. So bombs in country marketplaces, bombs in bars and nightclubs, bombs in the middle of busy cities. Yeah?
Did they do, like, have them on people too?
Well, that's my next one. Think about this. You're an American GI, you're a long ways from home, you're sitting, relaxing, smoking a cigarette outside a cafe or just sitting along the street, and this cute little Vietnamese kid comes up to you and you go and pick him up to see what's happening. They placed bombs on children. And when these American GIs would pick up these children or play with these children, boom. I'm not making that up. The last one's the worst one, and it was more than terrorism. It was almost like threatening as well. Now, this is a little off color, but it's what happened. The Viet Cong, if they would capture or kill an American GI, they would cut off his genitals, take information off of his dog tags, and send them back to his family at home. Happened all the time. So, not good, but that's true. Okay? The sending of genitals of American soldiers back home after they were captured or killed. That was another example of terrorism. And there's probably many, many more. But these guys did not fight a fair fight, so to speak. They fought terrorist activities. Very difficult to combat. Okay? That tells you the difference between the two strategies of the South Vietnamese American strategy compared to that of the North Vietnamese. So now we're going to get into some important information, and I'm not big on statistics, but you really do need to know these numbers. Okay? And it's American commitment in the Vietnam War. Okay? American commitment. We didn't feel like Kennedy would commit military troops to Vietnam. I'm going to tell you the commitment that Lyndon Johnson made. Okay? So a lot of statistics, but it makes a point. Now, public relations-wise, this was going to be a tough war because it would be the first war that would be what? We've never had this happen. In World War II, it didn't happen in Korea. What happened with this war? Televised. Every night, reports from Vietnam. So this will be our first televised war. And the American people will get a lot more information about what's happening in Vietnam than they ever got in any of the previous wars because of television. Now, this is a quote I want you to write down too, because it'll make some sense when we talk about American commitment. In late October 1964, this is a public statement Lyndon Johnson made about Vietnam and American commitment. Late in October 1964, I'm going to give you a quote from President Lyndon Johnson about his view of American commitment of American GIs in Vietnam. This was October 1964. He said, quote, "We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." I'll repeat it several times. Late in October 1964, President Johnson stated publicly, quote, "We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. Again, we are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to do for themselves. So when he says we're not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves, what's he saying in October 64? Not going to commit a bunch of American troops to Vietnam, right? Okay, let's see how that works. In January of 1965, there were 17,000 American advisors in Vietnam. Not troops, advisors. So let's look at the timeline. In January of 1965, there were 17,000 American advisors in Vietnam, not troops. In February of 65, a guerrilla attack, and that would be on whose part? North Vietnamese soldiers. A guerrilla attack on a United States military unit resulted in 7 Americans killed and more than 100 wounded. February 1965, a VC, or Vietnamese guerrilla attack on a U.S. military unit resulted in 7 American deaths and about 100 Americans wounded. What type of people were they that were killed or wounded? Advisors. Okay? Well, can Johnson sit back and take that? No. So to retaliate for that event that occurred in February of 65 is when Johnson sent the first combat troops to South Vietnam. Shortly after that incident in February of 1965, in retaliation, is when Johnson sent the first combat troops to Vietnam. So we have military troops in Vietnam for the first time in late February 1965. What branch of the service did they come from? The first troops to Vietnam. What were they? Marines. Very good, Marines. So, to retaliate for this attack of February 1965, in which 7 Americans were killed and nearly over 100 more wounded, Johnson sent the first combat troops, the Marines, to South Vietnam. By April 1st, 1965, Johnson had sent a total of 28,000 combat troops to South Vietnam. By April 1st of 65, now we have 28,000 combat troops there. By the end of 1965, casualties numbered approximately 2,500. Now let's talk about casualties so we don't have any confusion, because we'll talk about it later. What is a casualty? Kill, KIA, killed in action, wounded, or captured. Okay? So a casualty is someone that's killed, wounded, or captured. 2,500 approximately were the number of casualties by the end of the year 1965. And by the end of 1965, guess how many troops we had in Vietnam? 190,000. 190,000. Okay? So, by April 1st, 1965, we had 28,000 combat troops in Vietnam. By the end of the year, there were 190,000 combat troops in Vietnam with about 2,500 casualties. By the end of 1966, 400,000 combat troops in Vietnam. 400,000. By the end of 66, with 33,000 American casualties. 400,000 GIs in Vietnam. By the end of 1966, approximately 33,000 casualties. 33,000 casualties, 400,000 soldiers. By the end of 67, we're talking about American commitment in Vietnam. By the end of 1967, over 500,000 combat troops in Vietnam, American casualties, over 100,000. By the end of 1967, there were 500,000 combat troops, 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and a number of American casualties had risen over 100,000. Don't you think that's kind of a far cry from October 1964, when we weren't about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves? So by the end of 1967, what does the United States, especially President Johnson, face for the first time? Not yet. No, they're already there. What's he facing? It's not very positive. For the first time during the war, people are starting to question. Not quite protest yet, but people are starting to question the Vietnam War for the first time at the end of 1967 because of the commitment that he has made to that country. 500,000 troops. Well, I'll give you the peak. On May 1st, 1969, on May 1st, 1969, troops in Vietnam peaked at 543,482. So that's the largest number of troops we had in Vietnam during the war, and that was on May 1st, 1969, where the U.S. troops in Vietnam peaked at 543,482. And half of those troops let me make a point, half of those troops are seeing the elephant. That's an old Civil War term. What's it mean if you're seeing the elephant in battle? You're in the middle of, you're in a battle. I kind of gave it away. Seeing the elephant means you're in battle. So of those 543,482 troops that were in Vietnam by that date in 69, more than half were seeing the elephant. More than half were involved in engaging battle. Okay? Life on the line daily. Okay? That's the American commitment in Vietnam. Kind of different than October of 1964, was it not? Okay, now we're going to go to our next subtopic, and that is going to be 1967, a tough year for the United States in Vietnam. 1967, a tough year for the United States in Vietnam. I'm going to give you I'm going to give you 6 reasons why 1967 was such a tough year for the United States in Vietnam. These are all important. 5 reasons why the United States had a real tough year concerning Vietnam in 1967. Well, what might be one reason? The number of what? Deaths. Let's talk about deaths. In excess of 14,000 soldiers had been killed in Vietnam by 1967. In excess of 14,000 American soldiers had been killed. That's number 1. Now what, Brianna? Those that were killed weren't killed, you were wounded. Okay? In excess of 92,000 soldiers were seriously wounded. That's number 2. Number 1, 14,000 American GIs killed. Number 2, second reason why 67 was a tough year for the United States in Vietnam was that in excess of 92,000 soldiers had been seriously wounded. Now we're not going to talk about captured yet because we really don't know how many are captured. What might be another concern about the war in 1967? What? Money? No kid. Guess what the war was costing a day by 1967? $1 million per day is what we were paying to fight the Vietnam War. That's in 1967. That's a lot of money. $1 million a day is what the cost was. So good. Vietnam cost was staggering. What else might be a concern other than how much you're spending? And you're talking about how many lives are lost, how many are wounded, how much money you're spending. What else might concern you as a citizen about the war by the end of 67? What it's got? Long. Okay? By 1967, the Vietnam War became the second longest war in American history. The only war that lasted longer was, what do you think? Nope. Nope. Revolutionary. So by 67, the Vietnam War had become the second longest war in American history, second only to the Revolutionary War. What else might cause it to be a tough year? Kind of talked about, was the first war ever what? Okay, that was number 5. Television covered the Vietnam War nightly. They estimated 50 million Americans tuned in every night to watch the news because of events in Vietnam. Guess what percentage of the newscast in 1967 was devoted to the Vietnam War? You watch the news now, you get your local news, you get your weather, you get your sports, and you're done. Guess what percentage of a local broadcast was devoted to the Vietnam War in 1967? 90%. 90% of the news And this country was devoted to the Vietnam War and covering that war. So people knew what was going on, which will give me your sixth reason why it was such a tough year. When people found out what was going on a nightly basis at 50 million a night at 90% coverage, what began to happen over there, Mr. Page? You said it and I said not quite yet.
Protest.
Opposition and protest began by 1967. Growing opposition to the war. Can you win a war when you got a bunch of people within the country against it? Who do you feel sorry for in a deal like that? The soldiers. We'll talk more about that later. You now, by 67, have a war that people believe is not just, is not right, is not moral. You're going to start seeing some things like protests. Okay? So, if you're President Johnson, what are you going to do to curb this protest? What are you going to have to do to get people to quit protesting? What do you have to convince them of? Well, not only why, but we are winning. Okay? So he's going to turn to somebody to try to get the American people to understand, hey, we're actually winning this war. Don't worry. You're panicking. And the man he turns to was the overall commander of American forces in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland. This fellow right up there. General William Westmoreland, Johnson turns to and says, I need your help. So what does he do? What does he do? He brings them back where? From Vietnam to where? The United States, so they can get together and put out some sort of public statement about what's going on in Vietnam, because Johnson needs to curb the dissent that's going on. So what he did first of all is President Johnson got a hold of General William Westmoreland. And he brought him back from Saigon, where he was stationed, and he sat him down in the White House and they discussed the situation in Vietnam. And what did General Westmoreland assure the President of in that meeting? Things are going well. Okay, we're doing well. Well, what did Johnson ask Westmoreland to do once he found out they were doing well? He asked him to reassure the American people that all was well in Vietnam. So Westmoreland obeyed the President. He made a public statement about the military progress in Vietnam. And I don't want you to write this down, I just want you to listen to it. And he issued this statement on November 21st, 1967. This is when Westmoreland stated the following publicly. So Johnson asked him to make a public statement. Westmoreland says he will, and he issues his public statement on November 21st, 1967. And this is what it said. Don't write it down, just listen. It said, I am absolutely certain that whereas in 1965 the enemy was winning, today he is certainly losing. There are indications that the Viet Cong and even Hanoi know this. We have reached an important point when the end begins to come into view. Now, did Americans take that as a positive? They actually did. They actually bought that. They said people in the United States became more optimistic than ever. Matter of fact, after he spoke, we might have been at the height of our support. Okay? So Johnson's plan works. However, and this is what we'll end up with today, however, 10 weeks later, this optimism, which was as high as it had ever been during the war, dropped to an absolute low because of an event that happened in Vietnam 10 weeks after Westmoreland made that comment. Anybody want to guess what that event is that turned this war completely around to where it would never recover from protest? Anybody know? Anybody heard of it? Maybe the next subtopic? The Tet Offensive. And that's what we'll talk about tomorrow. This battle, known as the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, is going to turn the American people against Vietnam forever. Because Westmoreland just stood up there 10 weeks earlier and said that everything was hunky-dory and America's bought it. But when we tell you about Tet tomorrow and show you some footage, you'll let me know whether you think we're winning. Okay? Nice job there. Did that sheet get around?